Why does power escalation exist? In a story, as the plot moves forward, the stakes are expected to increase. This makes sense. If our main character is facing challenges that are on the same level or easier than the last, we as an audience have no reason to fear if he will succeed or not. A good writer usually wants to have their audience question whether the main character will succeed or fail. This creates suspense or tension and has us wanting to know what happens next. Even though I personally am always about 90% sure that the MC will be victorious, there's still that 10% chance that he might fail, and that keeps me engaged. If I feel like he has no chance of losing, my interest dwindles. Now, the plot is failing to keep me interested. However, the themes and characters can keep me interested. But why would a writer intentionally handicap themselves like this? So if our MC goes through 3 tasks in their story, it is general practice to make each task more challenging than the last. If all 3 tasks are the same level of difficulty, or they decrease in difficulty, after I've seen him pass the first one, I no longer have that 10% chance in my mind. I know he will pass the rest. So with all of that said, it makes sense how this applies to battle manga. In the battle subgenre, conflict is usually solved through battles. The type of battle is usually fought out with martial arts or a power system. So following the increase in conflict and stakes, the antagonist will get increasingly stronger or more will be at stake. I completely understand why manga and anime continue to do this up until today, but a little bit of creativity can create less pressuring and problematic solutions. First, I want to tackle the antagonist. If my MC beats a level 3 villain, the next villain needs to be above level 3, otherwise I have no doubt that he can win. As I said in my video on balancing, there's nothing wrong with power escalation as long as it's managed correctly. But if you can get a little creative, you can tackle escalation differently. Instead of relying on levels, you can rely on puzzles. I'll call this the puzzle method. In the most basic form, this can be found in Rurouni Kenshin. Several villains have a puzzle that Kenshin has to solve in order to win the battle. With this method, the villains don't need to get stronger because the puzzles aren't linear. A world-ending threat is objectively greater than a city-ending threat, but a fighter with short weapons is not objectively greater than a fighter with illusionary striped arms. This method works best when all fighters are around the same power level, and the puzzle is what drives the fight. The most complex version of this is stand battles from JoJo. The best example would be the fight against the Darby brothers. They posed challenges that were completely puzzle-based and had no combat or strength. The fights had to be won primarily with intelligence. There are several fights that are in between Kenshin and JoJo. Most good power systems have a mix of combat and puzzle solving. The escalation of stakes can still be applied to the puzzle method. Each puzzle can get increasingly difficult. That way battles don't require the characters to get physically stronger. Instead, the characters have to think harder. The escalation of the puzzle can also be combined with the escalation of power, but regardless of the approach, I can't think of an example where the puzzle method would have negative effects on the story. Now I want to look at consequences and stakes. If our MC saves a city and then a country, why would I have any doubt whether or not he could save a single person? Additionally, the consequences of one person dying isn't as high as a city or a country at risk. In most cases, I wouldn't care, but there is still a way for me to be invested in this downgrade of stakes, and that is if they are personal. If this single person is the MC's brother that we've known since the start of the story, assuming the story is well written, I could care about this conflict more than the city or the country conflict. And because this conflict is so personal to the MC, there's a good chance that he will be more emotionally invested into the battle than the past ones, which will then usually spread to me. In this personal method, the villain doesn't need to be stronger than the MC, they just need to have the potential to harm the MC's brother. Because even if the MC defeats the villain, if the brother is still killed, it will be ultimately a loss for him. So in the city conflict, our question is whether the MC can beat the city-ending villain. But in the personal conflict, we know that the MC can beat the villain, so our question is whether he can save his brother's life. A great example of this is at the end of Parasite. Spoiler alert. After Shinichi had already defeated the strongest parasite, there was one more battle. Murano, Shinichi's love interest, is captured by a death row criminal who is threatening to kill her. While Shinichi doesn't have Miki, he's still superhuman, so we know he can win. But we are invested because we are worried whether Murano will survive or not. Making stakes more personal can be as strong as or even stronger than making the stakes bigger. Stories can juggle these types of stakes instead of relying on conflict being bigger and badder. A writer can switch between these types or even mix them. I also understand why the puzzle method and personal method are not used as frequently. It's about ease. It's a lot easier to make my next antagonist physically superior than the last and have the MC train hard or get a power up in order to defeat him. But if I keep repeating this cycle, the balancing will break and things will get out of hand. The plot will be negatively affected because of this. If I keep making my opponent stronger, the MC will become too strong, and the only way for me to give him a challenging opponent is by introducing an even stronger opponent. There's no turning back. However, if I strictly use the puzzle method, the worst that can happen is I create a puzzle that is too complicated for the audience to understand, creating an unsatisfactory fight. But at least I have room to recover, I can always just make the next opponent have a more solvable puzzle, because as I said before, there aren't always levels to puzzles. They aren't always linear. Solving puzzle A doesn't automatically mean you can now solve puzzle B. As for stakes, it's easier for me to keep increasing the scale of what's at stake. I can just go from one person to more people to even more people. The downsides of this are big though. I have to keep creating larger and larger threats that have the power to destroy more. And once I take the next step, I can't go back by only using this strategy. However, if I use the personal method, the worst that can happen is that I jam in a new character that is apparently more personal to the MC than the last. But I personally find this mistake very easy to avoid. A little bit of planning will keep you far away from this point. And like the puzzle method, the negative effects on the plot are very contained. After I introduce this forced character, I can make the next conflict around an even more personal character that has been around for enough time. In conclusion, escalation is kind of necessary, but getting creative with writing and using things like the puzzle method and personal method can solve a lot of battle manga escalation problems. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out my manga for free online. If you enjoy my content, please consider donating to my Patreon. All important links will be in the description.